Hello, my name is Dave Emory, and this is Side 1 of For the Record program number 734, A Night in Tunisia, Part 2. Are Karl Rove and Wikileaks working with the Muslim Brotherhood? This program is being recorded on January 23rd of the year 2011. We're going to plunge right back into that fascinating, diverse, and yet highly unsavory dish, what I called in 733 WikiLeaks soup. We are going to be taking a look at some of the developments vis-a-vis the Tunisian coup, generally being hailed as a coup for democracy, which it may turn out to be, but it may turn out to be something else, too. For the record, 733 near the end, which was somewhat hurried due to the limitations of time, I encouraged people to avoid rating, so to speak, the Tunisian coup until the pinballs rocketing around the Tunisian board come to rest. One of the things that I was wondering about, and I should say that Tunisia is not a place I know very much about at all, one of the things that came to mind was the possibility that the Muslim Brotherhood or some related group might be coming to power in Tunisia. Certainly, we have seen that in other places, and it is interesting to hearken back. By the way, the Muslim Brotherhood is something I've spoken about at great length. If you're a newer listener, the Muslim Brotherhood is an Islamic fascist organization that dates back to the World War II period. It was allied with the Axis in World War II, then jumped first to British intelligence, then to U.S. intelligence. It was utilized during the Cold War to fight, quote, communism, unquote, in the Third World, the Muslim part of the Third World anyway. And it is the parent organization of Hamas, Al-Qaeda, and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, among other institutions. I remember when the Orange coup took place in the Ukraine, and everybody was hailing this as some sort of wonderful thing. And certainly I am no friend of autocrats of any kind, but it turned out that Mr. Yushchenko, who came to power as a result of that, was married to Ekaterina Chumachenko. And actually she became Ekaterina Yushchenko. She was the head of the OUNB, the Ukrainian fascist organization founded by Stefan Bandera, contributed heavily to the 14th Waffen-SS Division, and elements of the OUNB have figured in machinations ranging from the assassination of President Kennedy to the depredations of the Third Reich in World War II, right on up through the Cold War and the destabilization of the former Soviet Union. It is, by the way, Ekaterina Chumachenko was the presidential liaison person for Ronald Reagan, part of the Nazi element of the Republican Party. At this point, there's very little else in the Republican Party but Nazi and fascist elements, and that is not an exercise in hyperbole. The Republican Party is really getting ripe, and so are their media outlets, such as Glenn Drek, as I call him. I wondered about it. Turned out that the Yushchenko regime wasn't very good for the Ukraine. Their economy is a basket case. There's a lot of very seriously deprived people in the Ukraine, although we won't hear much about that here. After Yushchenko stepped down, the new Ukrainian government has rescinded the naming of Stefan Bandera as a hero of the Ukraine. Yushchenko did that just before leaving power. I wonder about the same thing in Tunisia. And we're going to review some of the things that we spoke about in For the Record program 733. WikiLeaks is a very interesting phenomenon. We see the so-called progressive sector, people like Michael Moore, progressive luminaries like Daniel Ellsberg and others oozing all over the WikiLeaks milieu, and they're being hailed, particularly by young and idealistic people, as a vanguard of change and enlightenment. There's an old adage that says, count your buttons before doing them up, because at the epicenter of WikiLeaks, we not only find Nazi financier Karl Lundstrom, but it turns out, look who has been holding forth in Sweden. Look who has a very, very, very significant presence in Sweden. None other than old 666 himself, the beast of the apocalypse, Karl Rove, the ultimate in Machiavellian politicians, and an individual who is as evil as he is is never to be underrated. He is a truly brilliant and far-sighted operator. And anybody that underestimates Karl Rove, well, you're probably going to end up dead. You will certainly be very, very, very much discomfited because he is very brilliant, ruthless, and far-sighted. And he has a lot of power. And it turns out that after he left George W. Bush, or he didn't leave him after he stepped down from the sinking Bush ship, he hopped onto the ship of the current Prime Minister of Sweden, Fredrik Reinfeldt, who has the moniker the Ronald Reagan of Europe. Very briefly, from the Swedish Wire that we read from yesterday, this from January 12th of 2011, Karl Rove behind Sweden's hunt for Assange, ? Former Bush White House strategist Karl Rove may be playing a leading role in the trial to prosecute Wikileaks founder Julian Assange, according to sources for several legal experts. Karl Rove was senior advisor to former U.S. President George W. Bush. He also was advisor to Sweden's Prime Minister Fredrik Reinfeldt, skipping down. Fredrik Reinfeldt has been called the Ronald Reagan of Europe, website Legal Schnauzer said. He has a friendship with Karl Rove that dates back at least 10 years to the George W. Bush campaign for president in 2000. Fredrik Reinfeldt reportedly asked Rove to help with his 2010 re-election in Sweden. According to website Dagens Opinion, Karl Rove visited Sweden last December. So it turns out that holding forth in the Swedish political landscape at this point in time is none other than Karl Rove. One of the things, as I speculated about last week, one of the things that was striking to me about the WikiLeaks cables that have come to light. Now note that, not necessarily what they have, but what has come to light. The bulk of them, that at least the ones that have been carried in the American media, have primarily been from Hillary Clinton / Barack Obama's State Department. And those disclosures aren't going to help anything at all. Diplomacy is a pretty cynical and messy business at best, but when you have the Obama administration looking to establish better relations with Russia, and this has been a cornerstone of Obama's foreign policy, leaking all of these cables, supposedly secret, in which U.S. diplomats are talking about what a sorry state of affairs Russian democracy is in, can only serve to frustrate Barack Obama's foreign policy. Likewise, Obama has been seeking closer relations with China. It remains to be seen what happens vis-a-vis the Chinese situation. Certainly disclosing critical, negative opinions of China from our State Department is not going to do anything to facilitate the Obama administration's diplomacy. And the disclosures in the Arab world certainly aren't going to do anything either. The point being that the upshot of the WikiLeaks disclosures is to destabilize Barack Obama. Plus, people forget that one of the very first things WikiLeaks came up with after the collateral murder video, which itself was edited, by the way, and also taken out of context. But one of the first things that WikiLeaks did was to leak the East Anglia University cables, which themselves were edited, and that cast great aspersions on the validity of global warming. Initially, it made it seem as though some scientists were actually gaming the global warming situation. The release of the East Anglia documents by WikiLeaks was fundamental in changing, at least for a while, but the public opinion was solidly on the side of, yes, there is global warming, until the disclosure of those documents. After that time, public opinion has been on the side of, basically, it swung public opinion. A majority of people polled after the release of that said no, they thought global warming was a hoax. That, too, works, first of all, for the benefit of the fossil fuels industry, and it also worked very much against Barack Obama's attempts at getting global warming legislation, cap and trade, and so forth. That, too, served to undermine the Obama administration. And also, the disclosures about the vulnerability of various facilities that the U.S. considers vital to potential terrorist attack could ultimately lead to a devastating terrorist attack. That will undermine the Obama administration, to release the Social Security numbers of active duty American military personnel. That basically is an act of war against the United States. That will permit the Serpent's Walk scenario in which a Nazi takeover of the U.S. is accomplished by the descendants of the SS after they infiltrate the army and then infiltrate the military, the army in particular, and then after the United States is devastated by a series of terrorist attacks involving weapons of mass destruction brought in through the established drug importation routes. Think of Daniel Hopsiker and Huffman Aviation and the whole imbroglio down in Venice. Martial law is declared, and the Nazi elements that have infiltrated the military take over. Certainly, the release of putting anybody's Social Security number online stinks, and anybody that does it ought to be reamed big time. Putting the Social Security numbers of active duty American military personnel could prove truly disastrous. So when one takes a look at Wikileaks, it is basically undermining Obama. Also, I want to repeat something that I said last week. I remembered early in Richard Nixon's first administration, this would have been the spring of 1969, and anti-Vietnam War demonstrations were at this point beginning to target, I guess one could say, or certainly they were being ranged against the Nixon administration. And one Nixon administration cabinet official was quoted by either Time or Newsweek, I've forgotten which, but in response to a question, well, you've just come into power, and so certainly these demonstrators couldn't be too opposed to you. And this fellow said, there's only one establishment at a time, and we're it, using the political parlance of the time. Indeed, I think we could update that. There's only one administration at a time, and WikiLeaks has made things immeasurably more difficult for Barack Obama on all fronts. Diplomacy with China, the Middle East, Russia, selling the credibility of global warming. All of these things have been seriously undermined by the WikiLeaks disclosures. And as we've seen in the past, at the very epicenter of the pirate vortex, Pirate Bay, the pirate parties and associated elements is none other than Swiss Nazi financier Karl Lundstrom, who has bankrolled the Sweden Democrats. And we're going to come back to them in just a minute. What we're going to be taking a look at, though, is the Tunisian coup and what might come out of that. From The Guardian, reviewing an article that we looked at last week. Article by Ian Black from the British Guardian, Saturday, the January 15th of 2011. Tunisia, the WikiLeaks connection. Mohamed Ghannouchi, former PM now acting as president, described in WikiLeaks cables as well-liked and respected. The man, now president, Mohamed Ghannouchi, was profiled in January of 2006 in a secret U.S. cable in 2006, recently released by WikiLeaks. Quote, a technocrat and economist, Ghannouchi had, by the way, I may be mispronouncing that, Ghannouchi has served as prime minister since 1999. Is rumored to have told many he wishes to leave the government but has not had the opportunity. Length of his service as PM also suggests Ben Ali, president until resignation, does not view him as a threat, and he is unlikely to be viewed as a qualified successor. However, average Tunisians generally view him with respect, and he is well-liked in comparison to other GOT and RCD ruling party officials, unquote. Then U.S. Ambassador William Hudson said, quote, given the fact that Ben Ali has a dictatorial hold, it is hard to believe he'll voluntarily step down, unquote. Even so, quote, the mere fact that an increasing number of Tunisians are talking about the end of the Ben Ali era is remarkable, unquote. Publication of WikiLeaks-sourced private U.S. comments on the corruption and nepotism of a hated, sclerotic regime is said to have helped create Tunisia's protest and generated talk by U.S. commentators of a WikiLeaks revolution. Well, I'm certainly no friend of autocrats or dictators or prophylactics, and I'm paraphrasing of any kind. But as I cautioned last week, let's wait and see before we anoint this the Jasmine Revolution and go dancing in the streets and scattering petals and engaging in euphoric behavior. Let's wait and see just what winds up happening on the Tunisian pinball machine once the balls have stopped ricocheting around. And one of the thoughts that occurred to me, and we're going to come back to this later, one of the thoughts that occurred to me was that perhaps the Muslim Brotherhood or an allied element might come to power in Tunisia. But first, we're going to take a look at a very curious detail concerning one of the incidents that appears to have sparked the Tunisian coup. Now, one of the inspirations for it appears to have been the leak of that Wikileaks cable, and do not lose sight of who is holding forth in Sweden, who has a great political presence in Sweden. Again, old 666 himself, Karl Rove. Boy doesn't go away, does he? Very, very interesting comparison of an initial disclosure from a Reuters story about the Tunisian coup and what sparked it, and then it got scrubbed, and I'm going to read you both versions. This is a Reuters story that was carried on Yahoo News. It's by Tarek Amara and Christian Lowe from January 16th of 2011. It's titled, Tunisia Forces Fight Presidential Guards Near Palace. It reads in part, Tunisian special forces fought a heavy gun battle with members of the ousted president's security force on Sunday, a military source said, and the prime minister promised to announce a new coalition government on Monday. Fighting erupted near the presidential palace in a Tunis suburb, the source told Reuters, following other gun battles in the capital 2 days after the Zina al-Abidine Ben Ali was ousted after more than 23 years as president. Prime Minister Mohamed Ghannouchi promised rapid action to fill the power vacuum. Tomorrow, we will announce the new government, which will open a new page in the history of Tunisia, he said in a brief statement. So the very fellow that was being discussed in the Bush administration cable that did get leaked is the fellow who has come to power. The possibility that there may be some State Department elements involved in this is not one to be dismissed lightly. But before we ruminate about that, skipping down in the story, earlier the opposition PDP party said police and troops had stopped a carload of armed men and shots had been fired outside its headquarters. And skipping down still further, police said they had caught 2 men with Swedish passports after one of the shooting incidents, and state television quoted a security source as saying 4 people carrying German passports had been detained in the same incident. However, the Swedish news agency TT said the men were part of a Swedish group visiting Tunisia to hunt wild boar who had been attacked by a mob. So exactly what role the Swedes and Germans allegedly there to hunt wild boar played remains to be seen. But it is interesting that we have this account of armed Swedes being detained in Tunisia. Very, very interesting. What is even more interesting was what that scrubbed story left out. Initially, that very same story had an interesting detail, which for whatever reason was subsequently scrubbed. That story used to read, it showed what it said were the detained foreigners with blonde hair and fair complexions being guarded by armed police, and said the arms they were carrying included automatic weapons. However, the Swedish news agency TT said the men were part of a Swedish group visiting Tunisia to hunt wild boar who had been attacked by a mob. Well, if in point of fact these blonde-haired, fair-complexioned wild boar hunters were carrying automatic weapons, that raises some very interesting questions. It's not the easiest thing in the world to take automatic weapons across a border, and certainly you don't need an automatic weapon to hunt wild boar. Why was that scrubbed? What does that mean? This is, as is often the case, I have more questions than answers with regard to that. But the fact that we have these Swedish and German people in Tunisia at the time that, in Tunis actually, at the time that this is all taking place is more a little interesting. And after the initial report surfaced, they scrubbed the accounts of the automatic weapons. Certainly that would suggest some sort of paramilitary operation of some kind. I want to review a news and supplemental article that, by the way, for those who are not familiar with the Spitfirelist.com website, one of the features that I instituted just not quite a year ago was something called the Food for Thought. In the upper right-hand corner of the front page, rather than the at-length and in-detail analysis presented in the for-the-record descriptions and other longer documents, I have some smaller posts because there's just too much going on for me to have everything in a big program. These are smaller articles, and then after I post a new Food for Thought, they begin feeding down the left-hand side of the front page of the Spitfirelist.com website, and then they go into the news and supplemental section. A Spiegel article has an interesting story. Strong operational links between German and Swedish neo-Nazis. This is from Der Spiegel of February 23rd of 2009. It's titled, Attack Reveals German-Swedish Neo-Nazi Alliance. That's the actual title of the Spiegel article. The news and supplemental posting is strong operational links between German and Swedish neo-Nazis. The Spiegel article reads in part, one of the suspects in the brutal attack by neo-Nazis on left-wing demonstrators last weekend is Swedish. The investigation has revealed strong links between Scandinavian and German far-right groups. Police in Germany investigating a brutal attack by neo-Nazis on left-wing activists just over a week ago have uncovered close ties between far-right groups in Germany and Sweden. Skipping down. Investigators now say that the suspects in the case include a 21-year-old Swedish right-wing extremist from Nyasmen. He is reported to be a leading member of the Blood and Honor Scandinavia neo-Nazi network, and he has a German-language website registered in his own name, which specializes in propaganda. Video messages by Udo Voigt, the leader of Germany's far-right National Democratic Party, or NPD, and his deputy Jürgen Rieger have been posted on the site. Well, obviously, one of the questions that I have is, are these blonde-haired, fair-complexioned, Swedish and German passport-carrying alleged wild boar hunters who appear to have been carrying automatic weapons, at least to the beginning initially, are these some of these Swedish and German neo-Nazis collaborating? And are they part of a covert operation to overturn the dictatorial Tunisian government? And again, I do not support dictators or autocrats of any kind. However, it remains to be seen just what winds up happening on the Tunisian scene. An interesting bit of rumination that took place in the New York Times of Wednesday, January 19th of 2011. Article by David Kirkpatrick and Karim Fahim. It's Dateline Tunis headline, More Officials Quit in Tunisia Amid Protests, and it reads in part as follows, skipping down. There was also a looming wild card, the revival of the banned Islamist party. The government said that for now it would continue to block the return of the party's exiled founder while he repeated that his party espouses a moderate pluralism. Many Tunisians said they were waiting, some hopefully, some anxiously, to see what kind of rebirth the once flourishing but long outlawed Islamist political party might have. In a radio interview, Prime Minister Ghannouchi said that the exiled leader, Rached Ghannouchi, again I may be pronouncing it, no relation, would be banned from the country until the government passed an amnesty law lifting a conviction he was given in absentia under the Ben Ali government. The exiled leader, meanwhile, made clear that his party envisioned a society far more liberal and open than Iran or Saudi Arabia. In an interview with the Financial Times, Rached Ghannouchi said that his party had signed a shared statement of principles with the other Tunisian opposition groups that included freedom of expression, freedom of association, and women's rights. It remained unclear how much support he commands in the country. Some argued that Tunisian society today was too resolutely secular for the Islamists to find much support after 2 decades of efforts by Mr. Ben Ali's vast secret police to eliminate the party and cripple it. They have people who are 50 years old or 60 years old, but they don't have anybody under 40 because of the repression, said Ahmed Bouazi, an executive committee member of the largest opposition group, the Progressive Democratic Party. Others argue, however, that the religious convictions of Tunisians would assure the Islamic parties a strong base of support, especially away from the more cosmopolitan coasts. Quote, look, they will easily be the most popular party, unquote, said one analyst who opposes the Islamists, speaking on the condition of anonymity and to avoid angering family and friends. Quote, no one can say anything against anything that is Islamic, unquote. Tunisia is not a place I know much about. It is said, and has been widely repeated, that they have a strong secular tradition. That may well be the case. It also remains to be seen if the Muslim Brotherhood, or related elements, and the Muslim Brotherhood is at the epicenter of the world's Islamist movement, Islamic fundamental movement. It remains to be seen just what happens if they come to power, and certainly the leader of that party has indeed now returned. Reuters story, January 16, 2011, Tunisia Islamist leader to return from exile. The leader of a banned Tunisian Islamist movement said on Saturday he would return. Skipping down, Tunisian authorities outlawed the Ennahda, or Renaissance movement of the early 90s, and the movement said it is nonviolent and the victim of government repression. I'm going to go back very soon, Rashid Ghannouchi told Reuters in a telephone interview. I have to come. So the leader of the banned Islamist party is returning to Tunisia, and it remains to be seen what happens. It may be that ultimately the Tunisian revolution, the, quote, Jasmine revolution, winds up being like the binary Russian revolution. Initially, the Tsar was overthrown by the Mensheviks, who were pro-democracy and not extremist, but ultimately pretty promptly, the Bolsheviks, by the way, who promptly pushed Russia out of World War I, and they came to power and, of course, instituted a totalitarian system in Russia, or actually what became the Soviet Union. Worth remembering briefly that Lenin was shipped back into Russia to foment the Bolshevik Revolution by the German General Staff, who put him in a boxcar and shipped him across to Russia to do exactly what he did, lead a Bolshevik Revolution which pulled Russia out of the First World War to the great delight and benefit of Germany. So it remains to be seen if what happens in Tunisia winds up being a little like the binary Russian Revolution. Initially it looks good, looks democratic, and then we wind up having a totalitarian coming to power, but mouthing platitudes about how pro-democracy he is. Again, what remains to be seen just what exactly happens with the Tunisian revolution. Something to remember is something that I talked about in For the Record programs 560 and 561, which is that the world's transnational corporate community is very pro-Muslim Brotherhood because they are very pro-free enterprise. They are pro-capitalist. In fact, they're even pro-corporate capitalist. And we should also remember, as we've looked at in, among other broadcasts, For the Record program number 721, dealing with a mosque in Munich. A mosque in Munich by Ian Johnson talks about the Islamist movement, and near the end of that, we talked about the fact that the Bush administration and the State Department and CIA were actively promoting the Muslim Brotherhood, and it appears to an extent that elements of Obama's State Department are doing the same thing, indicating the inertia that takes place within our national security establishment's institutions. By the way, as Obama becomes increasingly engaged, and I would be willing to bet, well, we'll see, that he becomes a one-term president. We'll see. But remember that one of the lessons to be learned from the assassination of President Kennedy is that the president does not run the national security establishment. The national security establishment controls, or really the corporations operating through their wing of the national security establishment, ultimately calls the shots, and I mean that quite literally. If a lot of the things that I'm talking about sound utterly wacko, etc., please utilize the archives. When we're talking, for example, about neo-Nazis working with the Muslim Brotherhood, that is not a new phenomenon. The Muslim Brotherhood worked with the Axis in World War II. In For the Record program number 456, I went into Nazi and fascist connections to September 11th at great length. They appear to have collaborated on September 11th. At the same time, the growth of Nazi and fascist parties in Europe is being greatly aided by the Islamists and the dislocation that they are producing in European society. Please utilize the SpitfireList.com website. It is a cornucopia of information of this kind. By the way, at the bottom of the front page, there is feed from the Global Muslim Brotherhood Daily Report to stay up to date on the latest developments vis-a-vis the Muslim Brotherhood. However, we're going to talk more about this inside two of the broadcasts. One of the things that one wants to bear in mind as we plunge back into that unsavory brew known as Wikileaks soup, and we take a look at what might become some of the implications or some of the outgrowths or outcroppings of the Tunisian, quote, Jasmine revolution. We've been talking about the Muslim Brotherhood. And the Muslim Brotherhood is, as I've said so many times, an Islamic fascist organization from the World War II period that has evolved into the largest Islamic fundamentalist organization in the world. It is the parent organization of Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, the Afghan Mujahideen, and Al-Qaeda. and it has worked with some of the reactionary elements in Western intelligence for decades, after having jumped from the Axis in World War II. And indeed, as we looked at in For the Record 456, there is ongoing collaboration between other Nazi and fascist organizations and the Muslim Brotherhood. Basically, the Muslim Brotherhood is the Islamic component of the Fascist International. Something to remember, something that Joseph Goebbels, the Nazi propaganda minister, said, and that was that we will use democracy to seize power, but we will not allow our opponents to use democracy to take it from us. That's something to bear in mind as we take a look at what may take place in Tunisia or what could result in resonant events throughout the Arab world. I want to stress again, too, that Tunisia is not a place I know much about. It may be that the revolution there will turn out to be a genuinely democratic institution or event, and that the Islamists and others will be able to simply form a coalition allowing other institutions and other types of people their own rights. That generally has not been a tradition with Islamists, however. One of the more intelligent voices on Islamism comes from the conservative side of the aisle, somebody who's generally excoriated in the so-called progressive sector and who unfortunately has associated himself with some of the more strident elements opposing in the 911 mosque controversy. But Robert Spencer, who does the Jihad Watch site, is one of the better authorities on Islamism, generally excoriated in the so-called progressive sector, and definitely from the conservative side of the aisle, but he's an intelligent and analytical conservative, although he makes his share of mistakes in terms of associations. His Jihad Watch site is valuable. And Robert Spencer at the humanevents.com website had an article about the Tunisian coup, ruminating about some of the possibilities. It's called A Jihad in Tunisia. Again, it's by Robert Spencer of the Jihad Watch website from January 18th of the year 2011. When Tunisian President Zine El Abidine Ben Ali was toppled from power and fled to Saudi Arabia on Friday, the Washington Post's Jennifer Rubin hailed this Jasmine Revolution as a remarkable event, a popular secular revolt in a Muslim country, unquote, that, again, quoting, poses an opportunity and a risk for the U.S., unquote. Mona El Tahawi, also writing in the Post, explained that a, quote, 29-day popular uprising against unemployment, police brutality, and the regime's corruption brought down Ben Ali. And again, bringing down autocrats and dictators, I'm all for. But if this winds up being like the Bolshevik Revolution or the two-stage Russian Revolution, in which the autocratic czar got kicked out, initially it was the Mensheviks, but then the Bolsheviks assumed power and imposed their own brand of totalitarianism, remembering that Lenin was shipped into Russia to foment the Bolshevik Revolution by the German General Staff. It remains to be seen just exactly what happens, but Robert Spencer here is calling attention to some of the possibilities, continuing with this article. But there are numerous indications that there were other sources of dissatisfaction in Tunisia with Ben Ali, including the relatively secular character of the government. Pro-Sharia Islamic supremacist forces are poised to take advantage. The popular perception is that Ben Ali was brought down by the will of the people. The French government declared that Tunisians, by toppling Ben Ali, had expressed their democratic will, unquote. German Chancellor Angela Merkel expressed her support for real democracy, unquote, in the North African nation, adding in a message to officials of the new Tunisian government, quote, I appeal to you to use this deep break in Tunisia's history as a new departure, unquote. A factory worker in Carthage had similar high hopes. This is like the French Revolution, he said, enthusiastically. It's the end of an era. I'm hoping there is real change. We can't continue like this, unquote. Political analyst Ahmed Lashin declared, quote, the Arabs have been repressed for too long. They are eager for change and are on the verge of an explosion, unquote. But what kind of change? What kind of reign of terror might come in the wake of this new French Revolution? Rached Ghannouchi, the London-based leader of the banned Tunisian pro-Sharia party, the Tunisian Renaissance Party, or Hizb al-Nada, was quick to dub the Tunisian uprising an intifada, unquote, and to claim it as a victory for Islam. The Tunisian intifada, he exulted, has succeeded in collapsing the dictatorship, unquote. Pro-Sharia MPs in Kuwait applauded, quote, the courage of the Tunisian people, unquote, and Abdel Malek Deroukdal, the leader of al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, hailed the revolution as a jihad and expressed solidarity with the Tunisians. In Gaza, the jihadist groups Hamas and Islamic Jihad were both thrilled at events in Tunisia. Hamas spokesman Sami Abu Zuri hailed the victory for democracy, and Gaza Foreign Minister Fatih Hamad emphasized that, quote, we are with the Tunisians in choosing their leaders no matter what sacrifice it takes, unquote. Islamic Jihad praised the Tunisian people for liberating themselves, quote, through blood, sacrifices, and the expression of free will, unquote, adding ominously that the toppling of Ben Ali was, quote, a message to Arab and Islamic countries to pay attention to the aspirations of their people that are rejecting hegemony and tyranny before it is too late, unquote. Islamic Jihad held a rally in Gaza City featuring hundreds of jihadists waving Tunisian flags festooned with the words, revenge against tyranny, unquote. Islamic Jihad spokesman Dawood Shabab sounded a drearily familiar note in accusing the Ben Ali regime of maintaining, quote, suspicious ties, unquote, with Israel. Meanwhile, a PLO faction warned Tunisians about waves of political Islam, unquote, that could follow Ben Ali's toppling, and urged them to, quote, cut the road to political Islam and its misleading slogans to avoid a repeat of the Gaza Strip experience in Tunisia, unquote, referring to the seizure of power in Gaza by the Islamic supremacists of Hamas. The great unacknowledged truth about Tunisia and the rest of the Islamic world is that Islamic jihadists and pro-Sharia forces, far from being the tiny minority of extremists, unquote, of media myth, actually enjoy broad popular support. Any genuine democratic uprising is likely to install them in power. That is why jihadists are hailing events in Tunisia and why all lovers of freedom should view those events with extreme reserve. For a Sharia government in Tunisia is unlikely to be any kind of friend to the United States, and if the Jasmine Revolution, unquote, does indeed spread and other Arab and Muslim dictators are toppled, an already hostile anti-American environment could become much, much worse. The events in Tunisia also show yet again the crying need for realistic analysis in Washington of the jihad threat, rather than the fantasy-based analysis that prevails there now. But that is even less likely than the flowering of a pluralistic, secular democracy in Tunisia. Again, I think Robert Spencer, as he does so often on the Jihad Watch website, again, excoriated by so-called progressives. It's valuable despite some of the some of the mistakes Spencer has made in terms of political alliances, including rolling around with, moving in the same circles as the Sweden Democrats, about whom we'll have more to say in a minute. Spencer does a good job. What he's not talking about here, though, is the fact that the transnational corporations and elements of CIA and State Department have been promoting the bleeping Muslim Brotherhood. Unfortunately, they always stop short of these institutional connections. And again, as we looked at in For the Record's 560 and 561, Economics 911, the Muslim Brotherhood is pro-corporatist, and because of that, the transnationals very, very, very much want the Muslim Brotherhood to come to power. Now, whether the Tunisian situation winds up becoming another sort of an Islamic, Middle Eastern, Russian, two-stage Russian revolution with an initial democratic outcropping and a democratic flowering, democratic with a small d, and then ultimately we wind up having the Islamists coming to power under the banner of democracy and then probably doing what they have done so often, which is to deny anybody other than their own any sort of reasonable self-expression. And whether this winds up igniting an Islamist revolution in much of the Arab world, which is pretty much dominated by dictators and autocrats, and many of those have enjoyed decades of U.S. support, this all remains to be seen. I would note, however, that already it is bringing calls to dissolve the Egyptian parliament from the Muslim Brotherhood. The following is an Associated Press story from January 19th of 2011. The particular AP copy I'm reading comes from the Jerusalem Post, and it reads in part, Egypt's largest opposition movement demands from Mubarak new elections constitutional amendments after the popular Tunisian uprising. Egypt's largest opposition movement demanded Wednesday that President Hosni Mubarak dissolve the newly elected parliament and hold new elections in a move that appeared to be an attempt to capitalize on the hopes for change sparked by Tunisia's popular uprising. The Muslim Brotherhood also called for an end to Egypt's 30-year-old emergency law that bans political rallies and demanded sweeping constitutional amendments to allow free and fair presidential elections. The Brotherhood's list of grievances is not new, but the demands appear to be aimed at seizing on the momentum triggered by the revolt in Tunisia that toppled the country's authoritarian president and galvanized opposition movements throughout the Arab world. Skipping down, the Brotherhood failed to win even a single seat in last year's parliamentary elections after taking home a fifth of parliament seats 5 years earlier. The movement, which is banned but runs candidates as independents, and other opposition parties say the vote was rigged. Well, it may have been rigged. What's worth remembering is what happened when the Muslim Brotherhood began to gain a serious role in Egyptian society. One of the very first things they did in the early part of the last decade was to call for the removing of sanitary napkin dispensers from the women's rooms in public high schools. Under traditional Islamic law, women are inferior, period, but they are considered absolutely unclean when they are menstruating, and men are forbidden from having, or they're supposed to have minimal contact with them, preferably none. And obviously the move to remove sanitary napkin dispensers from women's rooms of public high schools in Egypt was an attempt at keeping women from staying home rather than going to school when they were menstruating. Another of the Muslim Brotherhood's legislative gems, so to speak, was to attempt to oppose a law recently passed in Egypt that forbids female genital mutilation. That's too many syllables for the average American. What it means is basically the surgical removal of the clitoris in order to dampen female sexual desire and sensation. This is known in traditional Egyptian Muslim society as purification, and something like 98% of married Egyptian women over the age of 40 again, I talked about this in a past program, I'll have the reference, but had been, quote, purified, unquote. And the Muslim Brotherhood was working very hard to overturn the law that had been passed, making it illegal for women, basically, for parents to mandate having their daughters' clitorises removed. By the way, if some of this sounds a little dicey to you, I can appreciate this is sensitive discussion, but I think this is one of the things that really needs to be examined, is what exactly they stand for. Obviously, they hate Jews, they hate Israel, and one of the things to bear in mind, too, is one of the traditional uses of Islamists by the Germans and other fascists, even before they were fascist in World War I. Germany used Islamists as a proxy war force against both Russia and Britain in the Middle East. And it should be remembered that they have been used as proxy warriors. And in my considered professional opinion, and I've done numerous for the record programs about the Islamists as proxy warriors for the Underground Reich, literally a Third Reich that went underground, they are basically being used to, among other things, realize the goals of the Underground Reich, and beyond that, the corporatist community in general, establishing corporatism throughout the Arab and Muslim world. And also, basically, the Muslim Brotherhood is, well, most of their dictates are in keeping with Western reactionaries. They don't like Jews, they don't like women, they hate gays and kill them. They don't like black people either, by the way, and they favor the institutionalization of the privileges of great wealth. By the way, in the now divided Sudan, formerly, you had the Arab population of the Sudan literally committing genocide against the black African population. They're not just the animists and Christians, but against other Muslims because they were black and not Arab. The Arab world has completely exonerated Mr. al-Bashir in connection with what was a straight hands-on genocide. What we're going to take a look at, too, are some of the things. So, again, it remains to be seen what happens in the Middle East, but something to remember, something to keep in mind is this. If, and I say if, the Tunisian revolution winds up sparking Islamist revolutions or Islamist revolutions throughout the Middle East. And if the Muslim Brotherhood does come to power, basically there will be, then finally they will get rid of the Jews. There will be a nuclear war in the Middle East at some point, and that will bring down what's left of the economy. But one of the things to keep in mind is if we see a surge of Islamist governments coming to power in the Middle East, keep an eye on how that affects domestic politics here. One thing I will guarantee you, if Islamists begin coming to power all over the Middle East because of this, if this turns out to be something like a political wildfire, then you keep an eye on the Obama is a closet Muslim advancing an Islamist agenda rap that's coming out of the far right in this country. You're going to see that one really, really gaining some legs. And you're going to see the front-running Nazi morons of the Tea Party movement screaming at the top of their lungs, talking about how, see, we told you this is because Obama's a closet Muslim. Look at what he's doing, blah, blah, blah. You are going to see a political debacle in this country of unprecedented magnitude. Something to remember, too. Remember who is in Sweden. And remember one of the things that appears to have lit the match, so to speak, in Sweden. Aside from the Wikileaks cable, it's being called the first Wikileaks revolution. Bear in mind we have these fair-skinned, blonde-haired Swedes and Germans allegedly there to hunt wild boar, but according to an early, now scrubbed account, carrying automatic weapons helped to trigger this. And there are strong links between Swedish and German neo-Nazis. Bear in mind that Karl Rove has a tremendous presence in Sweden, where WikiLeaks has been based. And also, remember one of the many things that has been completely overlooked by the conservative elements, well, really pretty much everybody, and that is the lessons of Operation Green Quest. On March 20th of 2002, the largest terror funding bust in U.S. history took place, and when FBI and Treasury Department agents rounded up a bunch of individuals and institutions, on April 4th of 2002, Talat Altman, a director of Harken Energy, a longtime political ally, advisor to, and personal friend of both Georges Bush, who had given an Islamic benediction at the Republican convention, interceded with the Treasury Department, whose agents had conducted the raids, on behalf of the individuals and institutions who had been busted. And those were Muslim Brotherhood operatives, all of them linked to the Bank al-Taqwa, headed up by former Nazi intelligence agent Youssef Nada, and according to Ernest Bacchus, Ernest Bacchus is arguably Europe's top authority on money laundering. According to Ernest Bacchus, Bank al-Taqwa was founded by Francois Genoux, a top Nazi Swiss-based financier and the heir to the political last will and testament and collected literary works of Adolf Hitler, Martin Bormann, and Joseph Goebbels. The the aforementioned Talat Altman, was an operating director of the Muslim Institute that had been founded, I'm paraphrasing that slightly, by Karl Rove and Grover Norquist. So we have seen the American far right and doctrinaire corporatists like Grover Norquist, who labeled Teddy Roosevelt a socialist, giving an idea of how ripe he is, and Karl Rove actively advancing a Muslim Brotherhood Bank al-Taqwa agenda in the United States. And it is more than a little interesting to see Karl Rove holding forth in Sweden. One of the things that is interesting, too, is that, again, at the epicenter of the pirate vortex, as I termed it, and for the record 732, is the aforementioned Carl Lundstrom, the far-right basically Nazi/fascist financier of, among other parties, the Sweden Democrats. One of the things that the growth of Islamic fascism in Europe has done is to, well, for lack of a better term, it has sort of acted like the vinegar in the water that keeps a poached egg together. If you ever made poached eggs, and as an old short-order cook, I've done my share, you drop the vinegar in the water. It keeps when you drop the egg in after you've cracked it open, it keeps the egg together. Otherwise, it's going to go all over the place. And in a way, the Islamists in Europe are working in context with what Ahmed Huber called the fatherland concept. The idea in certain fascist circles ideologically is to have all the white folks in their countries and all the Muslims go back to their countries and everybody will theoretically live happily ever after. Don't count on that one. But the presence of the very Islamists in European society and elsewhere who are, in certain respects, working with fascist and Nazi elements against, for example, Jews, Israel, and the United States. They collaborated, as we looked at in For the Record 456 on September 11th. But the presence of Islamists is serving as a wonderful far-right and recruiting tool for European reactionary and fascist groups. And one of those is the Sweden Democrats, who have been financed by Karl Lundstrom. And a very interesting thing took place right after the Swedish elections. And in late 2010, we had the first suicide bombing in Sweden. This is an AP story, Dateline Stockholm from Yahoo News. Suicide bombing stirs Sweden's far right. The bombs had barely exploded in Stockholm's bustling shopping district before members of the far-right Islam-bashing Sweden Democrats rushed to their blogs and Twitter feeds. "Told you so," said one. "Finally," tweeted another. The government in just about every editorial page has warned against blaming Sweden's growing Muslim community for the December 11th suicide attack carried out by an Iraqi-born Swede who appears to have been radicalized in Britain. But the far-right fringe is doing just that in another challenge to Sweden's famed tolerance, already frayed in recent months by the Sweden Democrats' entry into parliament and a serial gunman sniper attacks against people with dark skin. Authorities say there's a risk that even more extreme groups, long marginalized in Sweden, will use the opportunity to advance their positions. And skipping down. While investigating the attack, the Swedish Security Services is also keeping an eye on any potential reaction from right-wing extremists, said Anders Thornberg, the agency's director of operations. This certainly is a very, very conveniently timed attack for the Sweden Democrats and other elements. One should not ever make the mistake of seeing the Islamists as necessarily mind control jobs or themselves witting tools, agent provocateur of the far right. The Islamists have their own agenda. But one of the questions I have, and that concerns accounts of Nazi elements being associated with the Swedish Secret Service. In the novels of Stig Larsson, which in many ways reflect political reality according to a number of sources, they're not unlike a number of books which, although are ostensibly fiction, but were actually based on reality because they're simply too controversial for people to come right out and talk about. And also in the Wallander novels, the Swedish Security Service, known as SAPO, is working with various neo-Nazi elements. One wonders if perhaps, and again, those novels, the Stig Larsson novels, are generally reflective of things that actually took place. One well-placed source familiar with the Swedish covert scene, quoted by Christopher Hitchens, said that the things that Stig Larsson wrote about actually happened, unquote. That may have been one of the reasons why he conveniently died of a, quote, heart attack, unquote, on the anniversary of Die Kristallnacht. Well, what I wonder is about this individual and the alleged Nazi presence or apparent Nazi presence in the Swedish Security Service. Was this allowed to go forward at this particular time? And again, Karl Lundstrom is the financier of the Sweden Democrats. He also is one of the main financial backers of Pirate Bay and at the core of the Pirate Bay milieu. He's also a patronizer of the openly Nazi Nordic publishers, who also publish some of the works that are published by the translators of Göran Jermos and Johannes Wallström, two of the anti-Semites and basically doctrinaire fascist individuals, Holocaust deniers, that are playing a key role as WikiLeaks spokespersons and apparently arbiters of what goes on the media in both Sweden and Russia. We talked about that in For the Record 732. So it's very interesting to see that conveniently timed Islamist attack in Sweden, which benefits the Sweden Democrats. Bear in mind Karl Rove's connections to the Muslim Brotherhood and the Islamist movement. And Karl Rove is holding forth in Sweden. Reviewing very quickly an article that we looked at in For the Record 707. This is a Daily Telegraph article, The Dark Side of Swedish Society by Stephen Armstrong. And it talks about the novels of Stieg Larsson and also the Wallander series. There has been a big upsurge in interest in the Swedish crime genre. Wallander and Blomquist, those are the heroes of novels, also wade through some of the extremely unpleasant undercurrents between Sweden's tranquil social order. In Larsson and Mankell's stories, both men encounter neo-Nazis who collude with Sapo, the Swedish version of MI5 and MI6 combined. So again, one of the things that we talked about in connection with the Stieg Larsson novels is I would not make the mistake of saying that every single thing is absolutely true, but they are reflection. They're basically portrayals of covert Swedish political reality, but too much so it's too controversial to be openly disclosed, and one wonders about the possibility of lawsuits, etc. Were elements like that involved with the allowing of that Islamist attack, which certainly benefited Karl Lundstrom's, excuse me, I got the wrong Karl here. Karl Lundstrom is Karl Jr., basically. Karl Rove is Karl Sr. Karl Lundstrom is Karl Jr., and Karl Jr.'s Sweden Democrats were the beneficiaries of that particular Islamist attack. And last but certainly not least, in a miscellaneous articles and updates show, I ruminated about the possibility of Tiger Woods being deliberately targeted for a media covert operation. Bear in mind that his former mother-in-law was the Swedish Minister of Immigration. Sweden has now been charged by a number of critics with becoming something of a haven for war criminals. And when the Tiger Woods imbroglio broke, it basically made him a very hated figure in Sweden. And also, it destroyed his image in the United States. And I ruminated in those broadcasts about the possibility of an elementary principle of behavior theory, which is stimulus generalization, was the Tiger Woods case. And at some point I'm going to do a program about that, because there are a lot of very interesting aspects to that. Was that meant basically as sort of an OJ2 psyop to turn people off on intelligent, handsome, clear-speaking black men, kind of like a fellow who's sitting in the White House right now. But that, of course, is going to be the subject for a future broadcast and future discussion. If many of the things that I've spoken about here sound crazy, incomprehensible, etc., I can understand that. Please go to the SpitfireList.com website. There is a cornucopia of information there which will help to enrich your understanding of these matters. However, this is all we have time for in this particular broadcast. This concludes Side 2 of For the Record program number 734, A Night in Tunisia, Part 2. Are Karl Rove and Wikileaks working with the Muslim Brotherhood? This program is being recorded on January 23rd of the year 2011. My name is Dave Emory. Thanks for listening.
And you can